Welcome back. Today's lecture is on Sandel's 8th chapter on Aristotle, and the word of the day is telos. Telos just simply means purpose, and so a thing's telos is its purpose. And you can tell that a thing is living in accordance with its telos or its purpose to the extent that it's doing what it's doing well and it's enjoying it. It's not resisting. So if we were to take an eagle and try to train the eagle to slither around the ground, along the ground, and eat rats, it would probably be very resentful of this. It probably wouldn't be very good at it. And it would be in accordance with its purpose, of course. If we were to take a snake and tape some paper mache wings to its back and try to train it to wiggle around such that it might be able to glide a little bit, it'd be a very frustrated, irritated snake, and it would be very good at flying because this wouldn't be in accordance with its purpose. The eagle has a much more satisfying, good life in which it's successful at its aims when the eagle does what eagles do, and that is soaring and doing eagle stuff. And snakes have much more satisfying, successful lives whenever snakes slither around and eat rats or whatever it is snakes do. So if you force something to behave in a way that's inconsistent with its telos, it's not going to be good at it and it's not going to be happy. People use thoughts about telos and purpose to make determinations about what people deserve, what institutions should reward and encourage, and to make determinations about justice. And we've already looked at this previously in the book, in the first chapter, in fact, whenever we considered what Sandel believed to be the real resistance behind awarding the Purple Heart to veterans with PTSD. He thought that people really thought that was an indication of weakness if they had this mental disorder from the battlefield. He thought that was the real reason why people thought that they shouldn't be awarded the Purple Heart. Because the Purple Heart, its telos, its purpose was to reward bravery and courage and strength, and therefore it's inconsistent with giving it to someone who has this perceived weakness. Now, of course, I gave us reason to think that any person would be susceptible to post-traumatic stress syndrome after going through battlefield trauma. I'm sure that I would most certainly have PTSD if I went through some traumatic events like that. But in any case, that's the argument that Sandel thinks is really behind it. Last chapter, we looked at affirmative action. And as you noticed, a big part of the discussion of whether or not affirmative action is just surrounds what the purpose of the university or the college is. And if we can determine what that is, that has a whole lot of bearing on whether or not giving persons from backgrounds that were historically oppressed or underprivileged a leg up in admissions, whether or not that's appropriate. In this particular chapter, we had at least two examples. One came at the very beginning, and it was the example of the head cheerleader's father who opposed the participation of another cheerleader on the cheerleading squad who was in a wheelchair. And the opposition that Sandel inferred was motivated by a conception of the purpose of cheerleading and the sort of virtues that it was supposed to exemplify and reward and encourage in the members of the cheerleading squad, the main virtue of which is athletic prowess. And if a person can get the crowd riled up in a wheelchair, that indicates that there's nothing essential about being extremely athletic and being a cheerleader. And perhaps the father thought that the presence of the cheerleader in the wheelchair degraded the status of all the other cheerleaders, including his daughter. Also, we considered in the chapter the case of the PGA golfer who wanted to use a golf cart to move between rounds. And this went all the way to the Supreme Court, which is odd for the Supreme Court to worry itself with such what we might consider a petty concern. But the worry was that, well, the opposition from many pro golfers was that pro golf is, in fact, a sport which requires some athletic exertion. Now, I think these golfers really giving themselves too much credit. I've played golf, and it is a bit of a pain to have to walk between the holes. But I've played real sports before, and golf is not a real sport. It's more exercise than chess, but it's nothing like running up and down the basketball court, up and down the soccer field. And I'm sure it's not even the same league with football, and I've done mixed martial arts, and it's nothing like that. But the opposition was, if we allow folks to ride in this golf cart, it'll degrade the sport in this way. So they had a conception of the purpose of the telos of golf and the virtues it was supposed to encourage and exemplify, and that's the reason why they opposed this stuff. So why am I going on and on about telos, and why did Sandel go on and on about telos? Well, because figuring out what a thing's purpose is has some bearing on what people should be rewarded when they're involved in the activity. And there's a question about what the purpose of the state is and what the state should reward or encourage. Well, Aristotle would say that the purpose of the state is to generate good character in its citizens. How does the state do that? Well, we can think about and reflect on the purpose of human beings by noticing that we possess a capacity that other non-human animals do not possess, or at least not to the extent and the level that we do. And that capacity is the capacity for complex language. And one thing that language enables is the reflection and discussion of complex ethical and political philosophy-related questions. And so perhaps it's the case that we possess this language because it's our purpose to do what we're doing right now, and to discuss ethics and to discuss political philosophy. And perhaps it's the case that if we don't engage in this sort of discussion in an open public forum, in the political forum with our fellow citizens, we're living less than full human lives, and we're not fully meeting our potential, and we're probably going to be frustrated and, at the very least, not upholding our obligations and responsibilities as fellow human beings. And so the state should at the very least encourage a robust political dialogue amongst its citizens. Perhaps the state should even mandate political participation, like some states do. I believe Australia legally requires its citizens to at the very least vote, but Aristotle would go above and beyond that and encourage people not just to vote, but to actually deliberate over complex ethical and political questions together in a very serious way. The state should also encourage citizens to pursue a life plan and a career that's consistent with their own nature. And so notice that there's a distinction between libertarianism and the different liberal conceptions of justice that we've already considered, which are neutral when it comes to the citizens' choosing of their way of life, and this Aristotelian teleological political philosophy, which would be non-neutral and would actively encourage citizens to pursue certain ways of life that the state might determine through the use of psychologists and sociologists and, fancy teachers and such, to figure out what's best for each person. So libertarianism, liberalism would say, we'll provide a background framework of rights. We'll provide, liberalism at least would say, we'll provide citizens with a rough equal opportunity to pursue their conception of the good life. We'll provide them with basic education, basic nutrition, basic health care, et cetera, and citizens, you go figure out on your own what you're best at. You become a priest or a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher or a pharmacist or a factory worker or a Walmart greeter or whatever you want to become. You decide. You best balance your interest and your desires with your personality, et cetera, and your background. Whereas the teleological, the Aristotelian approach would be much more interventionist in that you would have far more steering and perhaps active direction and legal requirements of citizens to go into certain lines of work and to avoid certain lines of work according to what is determined to be their telos. And so we already have a certain amount of steering. I remember when I was in high school, we had a vocational school and we had a tenure track curriculum for students that, or not tenure track, had a college track curriculum for students that the school expected to go on to college. And we had the vocational school for the students that were expected to go and work in some sort of vocational setting as a maintenance person or in a factory setting. There were a lot of factories down in Monroe County, and there still are. I don't think it was the case that students were required to go to the vocational school or required to follow the college track curriculum, but they were certainly encouraged by the guidance counselors. If you had the same sort of thing in your school, just imagine that taken to another level and then another level and another level, such that the state would come in and perhaps have very early level aptitude tests and then put children on a very rigid trajectory into a certain career at a very early state. And this is the sort of thing that I'm told anyway occurred in the Soviet Union and has occurred in other places. Maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. Maybe if we pursue our own life plans, we without too much guidance, we end up making bad choices. And if we had more guidance, we would be more happy, more fulfilled because, hey, if we're doing something that's not consistent with our nature, then we are going to be frustrated. We're not going to be doing it very well. And we're going to be like the snake trying to fly or the eagle trying to slither. And so maybe that's a good thing. Or maybe it's best for us to figure out what we should be able to do on our own. Maybe we know best for our own sake. That'll be one of your discussion questions. And now, in fact, we'll get right to the discussion question. So question number one is, which is best? The liberal/libertarian neutrality, where you allow citizens to pursue whatever conception of the good life they think is best for them, or the Aristotelian teleological, what you might consider an interventionist type approach, where you really steer, perhaps through legal mandate, citizens into certain career paths, certain life paths, according to what we've intelligently tried to figure out would be best for them, given their talents and their interests and their natural assets, et cetera, et cetera. I can imagine that turning out well. I can imagine it turning out poorly. But the question for you is, which is better and why. If you had to choose between one or the other, which is better and why, I want to hear some good reasons. The second question is, what's your telos? What's your purpose? And in what ways are you living in consistency, in what ways are you living consistently with that purpose right now? In what ways are you living inconsistently with that purpose? And what can you do today, to bring your life more in line with your purpose? Thanks as always for your attention to the course. I look forward to your answers. Hope you're having a great week.